Hey everybody, this is Kevin from Fort Orange Woodworking, and I'm really excited to show you this step-by-step tutorial for this rustic pine epoxy bookend table that I made for my sister's wedding. This was a bit of a tricky but also very satisfying and fun project, by far my most ambitious epoxy project to date. Let's go ahead and get started on how I got this build complete. Once I had my books gathered, I went and cut them on the bandsaw down to about 1.5 inches. And I know people are going to be really upset at me for cutting books apart, but it had to be done for the project. And honestly, I'm covering them in epoxy, which means they are going to be sealed forever, and they're going to be of no use to anyone having pages at that point anyway. So some of these were selected. You can see that there's The Great Gatsby. Some of these were selected for their content, and that one was one of them. That's my sister's favorite book, so it had to be included in this project, along with a couple others. But for the most part, I chose them for their size dimensions, as well as a variety of color, more so than their titles, like that one, and their content. Once I had everything cut down to size, I had a pretty good idea of how these were going to be laid out. There you can see the book selection that I have, a variety of colors, a variety of sizes, ready to get covered in epoxy. So the next stage of this process is to build the framework for the bookend top itself. This is a piece of 1/2 inch plywood covered in tuck tape. I'm using tuck tape, but you can really use any waterproof tape that you want, but this is a crucial step of the process. This has to be completely waterproof so that no air bubbles escape up through that wood. Once I have that done, I took the books over to the table saw for one final trim so that I can cut off any loose ends that might be hanging on to the books. And I did that with all of these because they need to fit in there nice and snug so that I can cut down on as much space as necessary for the epoxy part of the build. Next, I move on to building the framework for the tabletop using standard 3/4 inch finished pine. And I get a nice little dry fit here to see if those are snug enough, if I need to make any more cuts, if I need to swap out any of my books or anything such as that. Once that is done, we can go into the sealing portion of the project, and this is perhaps the most crucial step of the entire project, because books are made of paper, and paper has lots and lots of air trapped in it, and I need to make sure that every single one of these books is pre-sealed before I start pouring epoxy on top of it. If I don't do that, air is going to escape to the surface, and with books it's probably going to be uncontrollable because there's just so much air in paper. So I went and I put a thin layer of epoxy on all of the books to start, and to make sure that there were no pockets of air in there, I got my butane torch and I zapped them with that real quick just to release any air bubbles that might be trapped. As you can see, it cleans up nicely with the butane torch, and it gives a nice shiny finish to those books, which are going to be face up when this is all said and done. And then I went ahead and I did the same thing with the boards that are going to be comprising the framework for the top. Make sure that those are sealed as well, because again, air can get trapped in wood. Wood is very porous, and we want to make sure that there's nowhere for air to escape into the final top coat of this project, so everything gets a nice layer of resin to start. And once I had that laid out, I noticed that the books were trying to open up on me. The covers were trying to spread apart after they were cut. So this is not epoxy. This is just regular old clear glue. And what I'm doing here is I am just gluing the covers to the pages, and then I would go in and I would grab a random sample of pages and just stick some glue in there. And I'm not gluing every page together, but I'm just getting a little bit of glue in here and there so that these books have something to stick to, so that they're not just fraying out on the sides. And then I clamp them nice and tight so that they can so that the glue can do its job and these can harden. And then I switch over to epoxy again. So this is epoxy for the spines and the cut book ends. That is getting a thin layer of epoxy. And the goal, once again, is to seal every little bit of surface area so that no air can escape into the final pour. And here they are, clamped up, sealed. I think that this looks pretty cool. I was really excited about this stage of the project. I could see that where it was heading, and I was getting really excited. One more step for the framework is sealing the corners of the box itself. That is just clear silicone. This doesn't have to be pretty because nobody is ever going to see this, so you don't have to be great at caulking for this part. Just make sure you get enough silicone in all those gaps to make sure that no air tries to escape, and more importantly, no epoxy tries to leak out of the bottom. And there it is. That's what it's going to look like. That's the laid out portion of the top, and we are going to get ready to go into the pouring stage. The pouring stage is actually a multi-step process. This is my first pour. Now, if you have ever worked with epoxy before, you will know that it is fickle, to say the least. It often does what it wants. So the main thing that you have to be concerned with is, number one, is your surface level, because the epoxy will run to low points. So if you have low points, if you're not on a stable surface, the epoxy will it'll run downhill, and you have to move it around to where you want to. So I was using that spreading tool and the heat gun to get it into all the cracks and fill all the voids, all while trying to make sure that no air bubbles were forming and that no pools were forming. Epoxy can be a difficult material to work with, but there you see, it is very satisfying when it comes out nice and clean. This first pour turned out pretty good. It was a shallow pour. I probably only went about 1/8 of an inch or less. Most of these just got like a little bit of a glazing over them. It looks pretty cool. It actually looks like they're covered in glass because there's no tabletop yet. It's just the actual surface of the books and a little bit of coating over the top of them. And then what we do is we take this 320 grit sandpaper and we rough these up a little bit so that we can put our next pour in. It's important that you do this in layers. You can use a deep pour epoxy. However, because I wasn't sure how this was going to go, because of the nature of epoxy, I wanted to do this in multiple pours so I could fix any issues along the way. And I'm glad I did, because you can see there that there was some pooling going on. Nothing crazy, but I was able to get almost all of the bubbles out with my torches up until about the final pour. I did run into some issues with the final pour, but nothing that harmed the project in the long run. But I did this in a several pour process so that I could monitor it along the way. And that's what the second to last pour looked like. And now we are ready to go on and start the build of the table. For the building portion of this project, the table itself, I'm using 3/4 inch rustic white pine, and I'm doing a glue up for my panels using dowels. I could have gone with a different setup to create these panels. Depending on what you have, you could use your biscuit joiner, you could use pocket holes if you want, but I have a doweling jig and I wanted to use that for these panel glue ups, and I think it was the right choice for it. Gave it a little bit of structural integrity as well as giving it a nice flat surface. There is a shot of me a little bit later on using the doweling jig, and I'll tell you a little bit about that once we get to it. What I'm doing here is I'm putting some trim pieces on the tabletop using the same rough cut pine. This is cut down to about 1/4 of an inch, and it is mitered on the corners, and all I'm doing is just gluing it to the surface to give it that rustic appearance. It sits a little bit higher than the level of the books themselves, and I did that on purpose because eventually I'm going to do my final pour, and I need that final pour to have somewhere to rest in. Then we're back over to the table saw, cutting down to size our pieces for the legs as well as the panels themselves. I didn't use legs like you would see on a table. I made my legs out of the same 3/4 inch stock that I was using in kind of like an L shape. And there it is with the doweling jig. Now with any new tool, there is going to be a little bit of a learning curve. There certainly was for me with this doweling jig. But once you kind of understand how the concept works, it becomes pretty easy. Then it's just a matter of finishing my panel glue ups. And what I'm doing here is, well, I'm just gluing them up. But you'll see in a second, I'm going to put these in my, there it is. I'm going to put these in my Rockler panel clamps. These are the large size. I have a complete review of the Rockler panel clamps in my video section. I'll post a link above. There you see it. And I also have the mini version of these, which are really handy. So what these are great for is they apply side-to-side pressure like you would with clamps, as well as up and down pressure. And these have become really handy in a number of situations. I do quite a few glue ups, including my cutting boards, and these have been awesome. Like I said, I have the mini version as well, and those are very versatile, and honestly, I use them all the time. So go ahead and check that video out. And speaking of video reviews, I have another one for the Blockcision block setup kit that I am using right there. That little tiny blue block there that's down by my dado blade. Those are precision blocks that help you in measuring, especially like for table saw heights and router table heights. But I've used those in a variety of projects by now as well. And I've got my dado set up to 3/4 of an inch because I'm cutting a groove for the shelf. Cut that dado in there, and I'm going to do that on all 3 of my panels so that I have a place for the shelf to rest in. And once I have the dados cut, it's just a matter of putting a little bit of glue in the groove, sliding that shelf right in, and that's where it's going to stay. No nails, no screws. I used no nails or screws in any part of this project. This is 100% held together by either glue or friction or just other traditional joinery methods. The only screws that are on it, in fact at all, are in the hardware. And once I get the shelf in there, it's just a matter of throwing a couple clamps on, tapping it into place, and making sure that it's not going to go anywhere. And then this is pretty much starting to look like a piece of furniture. So we're making progress. Then we can go back to working on the tabletop itself, and I have moved locations, and I went to an area that has, outside of my workshop, that has less dust because I don't want any dust getting into the final pour. You can see here I'm using a tuck tape wrapped piece of wood to do my initial stirring with. Because I don't want to use a piece of wood that's going to have air trapped in it and get any bubbles or wood particles in the epoxy. This part is very, very important that I get it right. And you can see behind me on the table there, right there, I'm sticking that into a pot of hot water. And what the hot water does is it helps to release any bubbles that might be trapped in the epoxy during the mixing process. Now, You're always going to have bubbles when you mix epoxy. The only exception is if you use some sort of vacuum chamber, which I don't have. People that deal with epoxy on a professional level that do this all the time, they have pressure chambers and pressure pots that they use to mix their epoxy in to avoid those bubbles. But I just take as many steps as I can to make sure that I reduce the chance of bubbles, knowing that I can't fully eliminate them. Once I have that mixed, I'm going to go ahead and complete that final pour. You can see it's going on pretty clear. I've got it pre-warmed, I've got it mixed carefully, and it's going on nice and easy. However, epoxy, like I mentioned before, is very fickle, and it's subject to a lot of different things. How you mix it, the ratio, the temperature that day, the barometric pressure, the humidity. I've heard so many horror stories of epoxy projects gone wrong just at the last minute. So this step is a little nerve-wracking, and you take as many steps as you can to eliminate that risk, knowing that it's never going to fully be zero. So I spread this around, get a nice even coat, and in full disclosure, I actually do get a little bit of bubble haze towards the end here, despite my best efforts. I don't know what caused it. Something did, but it didn't ruin the project. But right there on that black and gold book, I got a little bit of like a milky haze. You might be able to see it in some of these close-up shots. But other than that one spot, it's pretty clear, and I was pretty happy with it, so there's no need to go back and try to fix it. And here you'll see some nice close-up shots of that clear, glossy finish. And there's that little bit of that swirl, that little bit of milky haze. I'm not too concerned about it. It looks worse in the pictures than it does in person, so I was ready to move on. The door front was one of the easier parts of the project. The panels have already been built, and the hardware is pretty simple. I just gotta put a couple of chisel notches in here for the inset for my brass hardware, and then I could just attach the door right to the front panel. I have another video about sharpening chisels with inexpensive stones that is worth looking at if you are just getting started in woodworking and you've got your own tools that require sharpening. You definitely need to learn the process on how to sharpen your tools. Paul Sellers has probably the best videos out there, but I think mine is pretty good from a beginner standpoint if you want to check that out in the video section. And then, like I said, finally we just install this brass hardware for the door front to attach. And this is a mostly assembled piece of furniture at that point. And here we're just putting on some finishing touches with the hand plane, making sure that that door front fits nice and snug without being too tight. We want to make sure it opens and closes smoothly. And then finally we put the top on the cabinet. This is held in there with those 4 square dowel pegs that I made, and basically just the weight of the top itself. It's pretty heavy. It weighs about 20 or 25 pounds or so with all that paper and books and the epoxy soaking it all in. But that's it. No screws, no nails, just glue and some good old friction fit. That is one finished piece. And there you have it. That is one finished rustic pine bookend epoxy end table. Oof, that is a mouthful. It's a lot cooler than it sounds though. I've got a whole bunch of pictures here for you to look at. I think this turned out pretty great. I was happy with it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please remember to like and subscribe if you have not done so already. And you can check out our Etsy shop, Fort Orange Woodworks, for products that we sell. Again, I hope you enjoyed. I will see you next time in the shop. Thanks everybody. Take care.